The dinner had been her idea, which should have told me everything before I even sat down. Diane always chose the restaurant when she had something to say that she wanted witnesses for, and that night she'd picked the steakhouse downtown, the one with white tablecloths and a maitre d' who knew her by name, the kind of place where the lighting was flattering and the wine list was longer than the menu, designed for exactly the sort of conversation she seemed to have planned. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table as we walked in, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that maybe this was it. Maybe after 2 years, after everything, she'd finally decided to accept me. I'd been engaged to her son for 4 months by then, together with him for 2 years before that, and in all that time Diane had never once looked at me like I belonged in his life. She was polite in the careful, surgical way some people are polite, every compliment sanded down to hide the edge underneath it. "You're so disciplined," she'd say, in a tone that somehow made discipline sound like a character flaw. "It must be nice to have such a structured life." She asked about my deployment history the way other people ask about diseases, with a kind of clinical distance, gathering symptoms like she was building a case file she hadn't yet decided to submit. I was a helicopter mechanic, 3 years into a 6-year commitment, 2 deployments already behind me, and a third looming somewhere on the horizon we hadn't yet dared to talk about out loud, not even with each other, let alone with his mother. Ethan had known exactly what he was signing up for when he proposed on a beach in Corpus Christi 8 months earlier, getting down on one knee in the sand while my unit's next rotation sat unspoken between us like something we'd both silently agreed to deal with later. He'd watched me leave once already, had written me letters every single week I was gone. Actual paper letters, he said, felt more real than texts, had been standing at the airfield with a ridiculous bouquet of grocery store flowers when I came home, grinning like an idiot in the Texas heat. I thought that history meant something had been settled between us, some understanding reached and sealed. I didn't know his mother still considered it an open question, one she'd apparently been quietly deliberating on for the entire length of our relationship. We were barely through the appetizers. She'd ordered for the table without asking, a habit I'd learned to let go rather than fight. When Diane set down her wine glass with a precision that felt rehearsed, the kind of gesture you practice in a mirror before you deliver it for real. "I think it's time we talked honestly," she said, looking at me and not at her son, her eyes doing that thing they always did, scanning me like she was checking for flaws in a garment she was considering returning. "About what kind of life you're asking him to live." Ethan stiffened beside me. I felt it before I saw it, the sudden tension traveling down his arm into the hand still loosely holding mine. "Mom." "No, let me finish." Her eyes didn't leave mine, steady and unblinking in a way that made the hair on my arms rise despite the warm restaurant air. "I've watched my son wait by a phone for 2 years. I've watched him miss birthdays, holidays, because you were half a world away doing a job you chose over him. I raised him to have a family, not to spend his life as an afterthought to a uniform." The restaurant noise seemed to fall away around us, the clink of silverware and the low murmur of other conversations turning into background static while I sat there absorbing the weight of what she'd just said, feeling something cold settle in my chest even as the rest of the room continued on obliviously, waiters gliding past with trays, someone 2 tables over laughing at something. I opened my mouth to respond, some measured defense already forming, but she wasn't finished, and I got the distinct sense she'd rehearsed this too, that this entire dinner had been staged as a delivery mechanism for whatever came next. "So, I want you to choose," she said, calm as anything, like she was asking me to pick an entree off the menu instead of asking me to dismantle a career I'd spent 3 years building. "The army or my son. Because I won't watch him build a life around someone who's never really there." I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to say something, to push back, to tell his mother this wasn't hers to decide, that we'd already talked about this 100 times in the privacy of our own apartment and had found our way to something that worked for both of us. I searched his face for even a flicker of the man who'd stood on that beach with sand in his dress shoes, who'd told me my uniform was the sexiest thing he'd ever seen me in, who'd promised he'd never ask me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. Instead, he looked down at the tablecloth, jaw tight, fork pushing a piece of asparagus around his plate like it required his full concentration. He said nothing at all. That silence stretched out for what felt like an entire minute, though it was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, and it told me more than his mother's ultimatum ever could have. I felt something shift in my chest, a kind of hardening that surprised me with how quickly it arrived, how ready some part of me apparently already was for this moment. Maybe I'd sensed it coming for longer than I'd let myself admit. The subtle comments over the past 2 years, the way Diane always found an excuse to mention Ethan's college girlfriend, a woman who taught elementary school and had, according to Diane, such a normal, stable life. Maybe I'd known this confrontation was inevitable and had simply been hoping, against the evidence, that it wouldn't come to this exact shape. I'm not choosing between them, I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt, though I could hear the slight tremor underneath it if I listened closely, the adrenaline making my hands want to shake beneath the table. I made a commitment to my country before I made one to your son, and I intend to honor both. If that's not good enough for this family, that's not something I can fix tonight, and honestly, I'm not sure it's something that should be fixed by asking me to disappear. Diane's expression didn't change, not really, just a small tightening around her mouth, like she'd expected this answer and had already prepared her disappointment in advance. But something in the air between us settled, like a decision had been quietly finalized, a verdict rendered even though no one had explicitly announced it. Ethan still hadn't looked up from the table. I watched him, willing him to meet my eyes, to give me some sign that he was still in this with me, that his silence was shock rather than agreement. He reached for his water glass instead and took a long drink, buying himself time, or maybe just avoiding the moment altogether. We finished the dinner in near silence after that, Diane making stilted small talk about a cousin's wedding while Ethan and I both pushed food around our plates without much appetite for it. The steak arrived and tasted like nothing. I drove home alone that night. Ethan had ridden with his mother, some excuse about needing to help her with something in her car, though I suspected it was really about needing distance from me, from the tension still crackling in the space between us, replaying every second of the dinner, every word, waiting for him to call and tell me his mother didn't speak for him, that whatever had happened at that table didn't reflect what he actually believed. He didn't call that night, or the next. 5 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind that settles over a home when both people living in it know something has shifted, but neither is willing to name it out loud first. Ethan and I still lived together, still moved around our small apartment with the choreography of 2 years of shared habits. Coffee made the way the other liked it without needing to ask, the unconscious give and take of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. But something had gone hollow underneath all of it, a distance neither of us was naming, growing wider each day like a crack in a windshield that starts small and spreads the moment you stop paying attention to it. He came home late from work that first night after the dinner, later than usual, and when I asked where he'd been he said traffic, though I noticed his phone buzzed twice while we sat eating in silence, and he silenced it both times without looking at the screen. I told myself it was nothing. I'd spent 3 years training myself not to spiral over ambiguous signals, not to read catastrophe into every silence, because in my line of work you learn quickly that panic clouds judgment, and judgment is the thing that keeps people alive. But this wasn't a mechanical failure I could diagnose with a checklist. This was my fiancé eating dinner across from me with his eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, present in body only. The second night, I tried to talk about it directly. I set my fork down and asked him, plainly, what he was thinking, what had happened in his head since that dinner, whether he'd talked to his mother since. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I recognized from finals week in his last year of grad school, from the weeks leading up to his father's surgery 2 years earlier, a gesture that meant he was somewhere past exhausted and didn't know how to say so. "I don't know what to think," he said finally. "I love you. I do. But she's my mother and she's scared, and I don't know how to make both of you okay at the same time." "You don't need to make me okay," I said. "I'm not asking you to fix your mother's feelings about my career. I'm asking you to have a spine when she talks about me like I'm a problem to be solved." He didn't respond to that. He just nodded slowly, like he'd heard me, though I couldn't tell if he agreed, and we went to bed that night on opposite sides of the mattress, further apart than we'd ever slept in 2 years of sharing a bed, an invisible boundary drawn somewhere around the middle that neither of us crossed. By the third day, I'd started noticing smaller things, the kind of details you only catch when you're already primed to look for them. He'd taken a photo of us off his desk at some point. I noticed the empty space where the frame usually sat, a small rectangle of less faded wood, and when I asked him about it, he said he'd knocked it over and the glass had cracked, that he was getting it replaced. I wanted to believe him. I think some part of me chose to believe him, because the alternative required accepting something I wasn't ready to accept yet, that the man who'd once written me a letter every week for 6 months straight was already, quietly, beginning to unwind himself from our life together. He talked to his mother twice that I knew of, once on the phone in the parking garage of his office building, which I only knew because he mentioned it offhand, and once in person, a lunch he described afterward in 3 flat sentences that told me nothing. I asked him what they'd discussed. He said it was nothing important, family stuff, and I let it go because pressing him felt like it might crack something that was already dangerously close to breaking, and some instinct in me, the same instinct that had kept me alive through 2 deployments, told me that pushing too hard right now would only accelerate whatever was already in motion. On the 4th night, we had what I thought, in retrospect, might have been our last real conversation, as 2 people still trying to build something together rather than 2 people quietly dismantling it. We were on the couch, the television on, but neither of us watching it, and he turned to me and asked, out of nowhere, whether I'd ever consider getting out early, whether there was some way to end my commitment before the full 6 years were up. You know there isn't, I said. Not without a reason, and my mother doesn't like it isn't a reason the army's going to accept. I'm not asking for the army, he said. I'm asking for us. This is us, I said, and I remember my voice cracking slightly on the word, surprising myself with how much it hurt to say something that should have been obvious, something we'd agreed on 8 months earlier on a beach with sand between our toes. This has always been us. You knew that when you proposed. He didn't answer. He just looked at the television, at some sitcom rerun neither of us were following, and I watched him retreat somewhere inside himself, somewhere I couldn't follow, and I felt, for the first time in 2 years, genuinely afraid of losing him, not to another person, not to distance, but to the slow erosion of his mother's disapproval wearing away at something that had once felt unbreakable. I went to base early the next morning, the 5th day, for a routine inspection that ran long, hours spent under the belly of a Black Hawk checking hydraulic lines with a checklist I could recite in my sleep, grateful, in a strange way, for the mechanical clarity of it, for a problem that had a clear diagnosis and a clear fix, unlike everything waiting for me at home. I texted Ethan twice during my lunch break and got no response, which wasn't unusual given his own work schedule, so I didn't think much of it, tucked the small worry away, where I kept the others, and finished my shift. When I came home that evening, the apartment was quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet of the past 4 days, a stillness that had a different texture to it, heavier somehow. I called his name once, twice, and got no answer, and it was only when I walked toward the bedroom that I saw it, his side of the closet empty. Not ransacked, not chaotic, nothing thrown or left behind in haste. Methodically, carefully emptied, the hangers he hadn't taken left in a neat, spaced row, the way you pack when you've been planning it for days rather than deciding on impulse, when you've had time to fold each shirt properly and think through what you were leaving. I stood there for a long moment in my flight suit, still smelling faintly of jet fuel and the tarmac, staring at the empty rod where his clothes used to hang, feeling the specific, disorienting vertigo of watching a life you thought was solid reveal itself to have been hollow in places you hadn't checked. I found his key on the kitchen counter a moment later, set neatly beside a folded note, his handwriting careful and deliberate in a way that told me he'd probably rewritten it more than once, that even his goodbye had been drafted and revised before he'd allowed himself to leave it behind. I can't keep doing this to my mother. I love you, but I think she's right that I need someone who can be here. I'm sorry I didn't say this to your face. Please don't call. I read it 3 times before the words actually landed, before the reality of an empty closet and a returned key stopped being an abstraction and became the actual, physical shape of my life going forward. I didn't cry that night, not right away. I think I was too stunned, too busy running the tape backward frame by frame, trying to find the exact moment where 2 years had quietly become negotiable, where his mother's approval had outweighed everything we'd built in the dark of 100 nights when I was overseas, and his voice on a crackling phone line had been the only thing keeping me tethered to the idea of home. I sat down on the kitchen floor, still in uniform, and stayed there for what felt like a long time. The note in my hand, the apartment around me suddenly full of things that used to belong to both of us, and now just belonged to me. His coffee mug still in the drying rack, a jacket of his still hooked by the door, small evidence of a life that had ended without ever officially announcing itself as ending. I called him once, against the note's instructions, some instinct in me needing to hear his voice even if only in a voicemail greeting, and I got exactly that, his voicemail, cheerful and unchanged, completely unaware that anything had shifted.
I didn't call again.
Some part of me, the part that had spent 3 years learning to read situations quickly, to recognize when something was unsalvageable and act rather than wait for it to resolve on its own, understood clearly that the version of Ethan who let his mother deliver an ultimatum to my face without a single word in my defense was never going to be the version who found his spine 5 days later on his own. He'd made his choice at that dinner table, in the silence that followed his mother's words. The note was just the paperwork, filed 5 days late, after he'd finally worked up the nerve to make it official.